I'm not picking you up. Ah, okay. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Lynn Reese Hardy, and I am the Maryland Stockstad Director of the Spencer Museum of Art. And on behalf of the Spencer Museum staff, the Chair of the History of Art Department, Dr. David Catafouris, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual lecture, Experiencing Medieval Architecture, by the distinguished scholar, Dr. Paul Binski, as part of the Murphy Lecture Series. Since 1979, the Spencer Museum of Art, the Crest Foundation of Art History at the Department of Art History at the University of Kansas, and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art have been proud to sponsor the Murphy Lecture Series. Named in honor of Dr. Franklin D. Murphy, former Chancellor of the University of Kansas, this ambitious lecture series brings distinguished art historians, artists, or critics to Lawrence and to Kansas City, however we can do it virtually or live, to speak on topics in area of their expertise, yet of broad public interest. Dr. Murphy was also committed to fostering relations between the University of Kansas and the Nelson Atkins Museum, hence their shared participation in this program of teaching, lectures, and publications. Dr. Murphy served as chancellor from 1951 to 1960 at the University of Kansas. During that period, he was instrumental in developing the museum's collections and also supported many art programs on campus. He became a vital link between the University of Kansas and the Nelson Atkins Museum, where he was a trustee. I like to think that he was creating a corridor of cultural exchange within the region. His foresight and his gifts continue to contribute to the creative and intellectual life of both these institutions as expertise, students, art, and maybe most importantly, shared purposes flow between the two. Illuminating scholarship, art, and ideas in the visual arts, the Murphy Lecture is an annual reminder of Dr. Murphy's guidance and enlightened perspectives on art. And most needed now, I think, the collaborations between and among the public, museums, and the academy. But I'm especially pleased to introduce Professor Aurelie Marina tonight, whose positive energy, passion, and commitment define her work. She utilizes art in the Spencer Museum's collections with vigor and ambition. And in our exchanges as we come in and out of the museum, it is really clear that she is dedicated to helping students find what I'll quote her on, the rewards of slow art history, allowing themselves to look at individual artworks carefully and for a long time, and to allow even more time to consider the revelations that this inevitably uncovers. So I'm pleased to introduce Aurelie.
Thank you very much, Sarah Lynn, for your kind words and for co-sponsoring the Murphy Lecture Series with us for so many years and with such enthusiasm. I am delighted to be here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aurelie Marina. Along with Andy Hedeman, I am one of two professors of medieval art history here at the University of Kansas. I cannot suppress the delight I feel at introducing Professor Paul Binski as our 2021 Franklin D. Murphy Lecturer in Art History. Professor Binski comes to us as a Fellow of the British Academy and the Society of Antiquaries, and Professor Emeritus of the History of Medieval Art at the University of Cambridge, among many, many other distinguished credentials. He has taught at the University of Manchester and Cambridge, as well as at Princeton and at Yale here in the United States. He also comes to us as one of the most imaginative and fruitful interpreters of the art of medieval Europe in many media and at many scales, from the illuminated manuscript to the great church. And I mean fruitful quantitatively as well as qualitatively, as his bibliography extends to more than 150 publications over the span of 30 years, including 6 books of sole author, each in turn the winner of at least one prestigious award. We'll link the bibliography to the YouTube video later, but for now, I only wish to speak to you of 3 that have had particular impact in my professional career and in my life. The Age of Chivalry, Art in Plantagenet England, 1200 to 1400 of 1987, which he edited with Jonathan Alexander, was the first exhibition catalog I ever bought. And it is partly responsible for kindling my interest in Western medieval art. I think it was the heaviest thing in my luggage that year. It is a remarkable catalog for many reasons, not least the sheer richness of the exhibition. I think there were 700 plus works involved in that show. Beckett's Crown, Art and Imagination in Gothic England, 1170 to 1300, was published by Yale University Press in 2004, just as I completed my PhD. With eloquence and bravura, Professor Binski elucidated the multiplicity of spiritual and worldly beliefs and local practices embedded in the magnificent masonry of Canterbury Cathedral, and how this expansive sense of the possibilities of Gothic architecture took a life of its own at Lincoln, Salisbury, and Ely. This was not the study of architectural patronage that I was used to, and it transformed my sense of what the goals of the art historical enterprise could be. Most recently, Gothic Sculpture, published by Yale in 2019, takes aim at what has been called a new golden age in medieval sculpture studies by using the medium to devise nothing less than a new theory of medieval representation. Today's talk is one more stage in that process. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Binski to the University of Kansas for the first of two lectures on making sense of medieval art. Thank you very much for coming, Professor Binski. We're very happy you're here.
Well, thank you, Aurelie, so much for your warm welcome and for extending to me this opportunity to deliver this year's Franklin D. Murphy Lectures. I look forward very much to doing this, and I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person, but this will have to do. My experience is that the more concise a series of lectures or the shorter a book, the more likely they are to have some sort of impact. The subject of these lectures, however, is a very large one, implying many lectures and a huge book. And to make matters worse, in my first lecture, I want to consider a millennium's worth of writing about architecture, religious architecture specifically, in Western Europe. So there's nothing for it but to press on regardless, in the knowledge that what I can say today and next time can only be work in progress. My aim in this lecture is to treat historical experience as a serious object of critical inquiry. Experience has long been a watchword of various styles of engagement with the humanities, but it seems of late to have returned in the titles of works such as Mary Carruthers' The Experience of Beauty in the Middle Ages, or Herb Kessler's Experiencing Medieval Art, a revised edition of his text, Seeing Medieval Art. What was it to experience a Romanesque sculpted portal or a great Gothic cathedral such as Notre Dame or Palma on the screen now? Did this experience change? Was it a single thing? And how might we access it historically? The subject is a difficult one, and indeed it might be doubted whether it exists at all. Experience isn't, properly speaking, an object. In the language of phenomenology, a mid-20th century creation, we can think of objects as bounded and fixed things, noumena in Greek, and of apprehensions and experiences as boundless phenomena. It's surely a duty of the historical critic not to attempt to tie such experiences down too far. And yet, when we bring the thousands of artifacts and buildings together, so many noumena, so many things, how thin in comparison is the surviving evidence for the phenomena of experience, and how few great minds turned their attention to it. St. Augustine, to mention the greatest of all, has much to say about aesthetics, but little directly about things. Dante's great passage on the sensory powers of sculpture in Purgatorio, Canto 10, is a work of fiction for all its art. No, our quarry is hard to find and requires patience. In the ancient and medieval worlds, one such experience was wonder, a complex idea deriving from the Latin deponent verb miror, giving us admiration, and so on. The wonders of the world, first identified before the advent of Christianity, automatically imply an experience with articulable, if mixed, content, wonder, awe, as part of their very rationale. But there's no evidence that in this period particular experiences were thought of as being the intended end or outcome of encountering a Gothic cathedral or a sculpted portal. Generally, passions or affects, those movements within us that we later came to call emotions, were instrumental buildings and images, deployed affects in order to persuade, to bring about faith, conviction, action, not to fizzle out in or be reduced to a display of feeling. This is a point about means and ends, function and purpose. And that simple point brings me to some axioms, which I'm going to try to stick to in the course of this lecture. The first is that no matter how obscure our subject, our understanding of it is necessarily historically mediated. Language is vital to this. And so to reflect on the discourse of experience, getting the words right, may help guard against that widespread cultural appropriation of the medieval to the modern that slips past so easily nowadays. The second is that such experience talk is not art analysis of the type familiar to art history. We find both continuities in language and discontinuities in art styles. Today, I'll not strictly be concerned with form in the art historical sense. The third axiom which follows is that the type of phenomenology I employ here is not first person in orientation, but social. I'm wary of importing modern, individualistic moral and psychological attitudes into the Middle Ages. The social and so ethical nature of aesthetic apprehension is fundamental to what I want to say. So, in a slogan, if you will, we come before I. Finally, the pre-modern notion of aesthesis as sense-based knowledge of the world, rather than as a mode of disinterested reflection on it, allows us to see that making sense of something involves both sensation and meaning. Thought is integral to experience. I'll be giving some practical instances of that shortly, but I just want to stress that the experience of artifacts and their surfaces in terms of a united sensory and intellectual experience differs from the type of approach adopted by language study and the social sciences and anthropology over the last half century and more. These have tended, to put it rather crudely, to barge aesthesis out altogether. So, in stressing historically mediated language, the social basis of understanding, and the cognitive nature of sense-based experience, we arrive at the basic method of this lecture to see the verbal, social, and aesthetic as constantly in conversation in thinking about the nature of medieval art, its functions and purposes. My second lecture will be looking at the figurative arts, but today I will focus on the social, ethical, and aesthetic nature of the experience of buildings. And to do that requires us to begin well before the Middle Ages, indeed in the early 4th century, when something new was afoot in the Roman Empire. I said earlier that great medieval writers and thinkers don't as a rule hold forth about artifacts. Despite that, it seems to me that the major themes in accounts of particularly religious structures, such as Old St. Peter's in Rome, were worked out pretty early in the Christian dispensation, let's say by no later than the 4th to the 6th centuries. They were then carried over into the High and Late Middle Ages. Specifically, a significant number of durable commonplaces appear already in the time of the Emperor Constantine, died 337. As Richard Krautheimer and others have explained with great authority, Constantine's rule saw the emergence of a building type, the basilica, which could take many forms, but which was fundamentally different from the pagan temple, top right, already outmoded by that period. The experiential issue depends to an extent on whether commentators were talking about building interiors or building exteriors. Exteriors tend to excite less remark. Pagan temples of a type dispersed across the Roman Empire were essentially shrines holding images with limited interior space, prominent exteriors, and rituals both outside and inside. The basilica, the name derives from basilikos, meaning royal palace, is essentially a large interior space of no great external pretension, but huge scope within. Both for much larger congregations, priests, and other attendants, shrines, and altars. That the type was associated with earlier secular palace building types is of importance, and we'll return to this point later on. The era of the monumental sculpted facade took almost a millennium to unfold. The key point is that basilicas, though variable in form, could be extremely large structures with columnar supports, as at St. Peter's, big windows lighting the spaces brightly, extensive wall space, and patterns of movement and attendance that were at once democratic and hierarchical. With this unusual and essentially Christian mixture of inclusivity and hierarchy was to be associated an aesthetic exceptionalism. These were deemed to be special spaces, both by description and by prescription. When, sometime after the year 325, Constantine issued instructions for the decoration of the newly discovered tomb of Christ in Jerusalem, in what was to become the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he affirmed an aesthetic outlook that lasted for well over 1,000 years. In the third book of his Life of Constantine, the contemporary historian and Christian writer and bishop Eusebius relates that Constantine intended the new sepulchre to be rich and of imperial magnificence. He instructed that it should be a building out of the ordinary, huge and rich, superior to those in all other places. There was to be a competent supply of columns and marble. The building was then provided with superb columns and full ornamentation and brightened with artworks. It was, in Eusebius's words, an extraordinary structure, raised to an immense height, extensive in length and breadth. Its interior shone with varied marble, its walls gleaming with close-fitted stones. The whole thing glittered with beams of light. And at its end was an apse, ringed with 12 columns to match the number of the apostles. Of these untold beauties, it was impossible to say enough about their size, variety, and number. And of course, there's contrast too. Eusebius comments on the shrine to Venus Aphrodite, deliberately erected on Golgotha by the Romans, that it was no more than what he calls a terrible and truly genuine tomb for dead idols with a gloomy sanctuary. Aesthetic terms, you see, stand in relation to one another. Here, contrast, opposition, conveys an entire value system put forth in prescriptive as much as descriptive form. Another instance is Eusebius's account of the cathedral at Tyre in South Lebanon, a marvel of beauty, utterly breathtaking, especially for those with eyes only for material things. Eusebius's Holy Sepulchre and church at Tyre demonstrate discursive terminology, which was to become a norm: dazzle, amazement, richness, immense height, great variety, marvelous materials, and so on. Eusebius, as we just heard, likens the columns to apostles, as do later writers. And, as with all such texts, there's an occasion for saying all this, the demonstration of God's favor to Constantine. All the terms just mentioned, I think we can agree, are positive, not negative ones, just as the occasion of the text, the context, if you will, is the praise of an exceptional person who makes things great, is magnificent, magnificence being, after all, literally a making great. Some of the terms originate in the pre-Christian discourse of the wonders of the world: great size, expensive materials, sheer beauty, as well as being wonderful. In terms of levels of rhetorical writing, Such occasions are basically panegyrics, praising cities, buildings, and especially people, panegyric being a part of epideictic or display oratory. The reader doesn't need to be persuaded, because they already are. Epideisis just makes everything even more evident in an artful way, especially that which serves our appetite in the display of beauty and the praise of great deeds, which serves our desire for the heroic. Indeed, and this is a very large theme, such occasions hold true not only for early writing elsewhere. Consider what the historian Procopius has to say in the 6th century about the Hagia Sophia in front of us now, and other buildings in his panegyric of the Emperor Justinian, the same occasion. Procopius goes on to describe the mosaics of the Chalki, the vestibule of the imperial palace in Constantinople, where were to be found images of Justinian's great deeds, his magnificence. These scenes, says Procopius, I quote, are indicated by the mosaic cubes, which on their faces take on a joyful bloom. So they smile proudly as they offer the emperor divine honors because of the magnificence of his achievements. End quote. Well, much could be made of that passage and its transferred epithets, the mosaic cubes smiling. And I'll be returning to this type of thought in my second lecture. But I stress panegyric precisely because it makes us attend to the porous boundary between buildings and persons, by which I mean what is often thought of as the metaphorical and allegorical overlaying of ideas of building by ideas about people. And that's really the theme of my lecture today. The people might be patrons, they might be saints. But the point is that, like the saints and martyrs, the churches too are witnesses. Christianity was at once monotheistic in its core beliefs, but profoundly social, if not pantheistic, in its notion of the charismatic community of believers and saints. And as such, its places of witness were not separable from human ethics and affects, for these were built in to such places. Here's a cross-section of the nave of Old St. Peter's. Consider a fundamental and very striking insight into the Constantinian Basilica by art historian John Mitchell. We know that such 4th century basilicas as the Lateran and Old St. Peter's in Rome were columnar buildings, in which the major and indeed lofty walls were sustained on columns and entablatures. This use of columns and extensive walls was new. As Mitchell and others have pointed out, since St. Paul, it was not unusual to liken Christ and saints to parts of edifices, the saints and witnesses being columns of the church built of living stones, Christ being the cornerstone. We heard about that in Eusebius a moment ago. These are, of course, metaphors used of the saints as pillars of the Christian community throughout the high medieval period, forming part of a system of allegory thereafter developed richly by Bede and the Victorines down to Durandus in the 13th century. We still know, after all, don't we, what we mean when we refer to somebody being a pillar of the community. Well, usually we see such metaphors as after the event, post-festum impositions on pre-existing buildings. John Mitchell, on the contrary, argues that the Constantinian basilicas were not only revolutionary high-tech structures, a fair point when one considers that Old St. Peter's in layout, scale, thin walls and columns is an anticipation, if we wish to see it as such, of Paris's Notre Dame, begun in the 12th century, on the left, also a 5-aisled columnar basilica just of that type, but with stone vaulting. Eusebius's images of the columns as apostles also occurred just at this moment at Saint-Denis in Paris in the 1140s, and Saint-Denis influenced Canterbury on the right, also a columnar Gothic church. To Mitchell, and I think he's right, such columns consciously applied the symbolism of witness. The use of columns was an intentional choice, which produced a new form of building with tall walls, covered in exemplary narratives of the saints, propped up by columns conceived as people. The building didn't produce the allegory produced the building. To the empirical mindset, which thinks of meanings and symbols as superficial add-ons to structures designed in order to solve problems, such a proposal is a challenge, but I think it's a worthwhile one. Well, I'll be getting back to that idea in my second lecture when I return to Canterbury in the 12th century and the way that things were seen in buildings. As well as the physical sentences, language, thought are all involved in making sense of medieval art. My point is that allegory, panegyric, exceptionalist aesthetics, the mixture of public and hierarchical space, and above all the ethics of the Christian community led by the positive example of the apostles, martyrs, and saints, are all inextricably connected within the discourse of experience. Experience isn't solely a psychological phenomenon, and nor is it necessarily distinguishable from what we now think of as the zones of morality and meaning. And this possibility, I think, was in the first instance a creation not so much of the ancient world as of early Christianity itself. So it follows that the notion of experience as a complex thing cannot be confused with what we would now consider to be analysis of the architecture itself, since such analysis is a matter of science, causality, not perception, and yet perception is all. Our interest isn't solely in the way such buildings actually were, but as they seemed to be, were apparent or virtual. For me, the role of criticism is to make sense of things. I stress the word sense precisely to show how sense-based knowledge or aesthesis must be part of that critical process. Well, my emphasis on the culture-specific account of experience, which promoted an essentially positive, ethical and aesthetic or socio-aesthetic perception of religious buildings, isn't one to which we are necessarily habituated, and for one clear, if not particularly good reason. And that is that since at least the 18th century, a very different experiential dispensation has formed about the Middle Ages, profoundly influenced by the idea of the sublime. And to let me illustrate how deep that runs, let me start with a practical example of a scientifically minded and extremely good modern architectural historian associated in his early career with Kansas, writing in a general way about the Gothic cathedral. I mean, of course, Robert Branner, writing in 1961 in a general book. He says the transcendental character of medieval religious architecture was given a special form in the Gothic church. Medieval man considered himself but an imperfect refraction of the divine light of God, whose temple on earth, according to the text of the dedication ritual, stood for the heavenly city of Jerusalem. The Gothic interpretation of this point of view was a monument that seems to dwarf the man who enters it, for space, light, structure, and the plastic effects of the masonry are organized to produce a visionary scale. He goes on to say the result is a distortion. Large as it may be in real size, the Gothic church becomes prodigiously vast in appearance. Well, the Platonic and Romantic heritage of these sentiments is clear. The vastness and distortive character of Gothic is highlighted by a form of romantic sublime, or belittlement, or dwarfing. And we respond to the cathedral not as it is, but rather to a virtual image, prodigiously vast in appearance. Well, as we know from the history of Romanticism, the poets Goethe and Coleridge provide us with formulations of exactly this mindset. Here we are at Strasbourg. Consider Goethe's great description of the overweening Gothic of this great church, a masterpiece of German culture, as an example. And witness also Coleridge's lectures as published in 1849. Coleridge says, the contemplation of the works of antique art excites a feeling of elevated beauty and exalted notions of the human self, but the Gothic architecture impresses the beholder with a sense of self-annihilation. He becomes, as it were, a part of the work contemplated. When I enter a Greek church, my eye is charmed and my mind is elated. I feel exalted and proud that I am a man. But the Gothic art is sublime. On entering a cathedral, I'm filled with devotion and with awe. I'm lost in the actualities that surround me, and my whole being expands into the infinite. The only sensible impression left is that I am nothing. Well, I want to suggest that this Greek Gothic distinction has, in the long run, caused quite unnecessary and persistent problems. This apposition of the Hellenic and Gothic, so typical of the struggle of style in the 18th and 19th century, overlooks the fundamental continuity of discourse between the ancient world and the Middle Ages that I hinted at in my opening remarks. If what I've said so far is true, Coleridge's elation, exaltation, and elevation are no less true of medieval architectural experience. Indeed, they're central to it, and its ideas of great speech, magna loquentia. And it follows from this that whether or not the notion of the sublime as a transhistorical or historically mediated category may be useful in the field of literary study, it isn't central to medieval building experience or the type of phenomenon, artifactual criticism that I'm discussing today. I can't pretend that this critical approach is in any way universal nowadays. As I suggested a moment ago, the empirical tendencies of architectural history, certainly in Britain, have tended not so much to assume an affective stance on architecture as simply to sidestep the entire issue. Now, as it happens, I don't believe that Robert Branner was a serious proponent of the sublime, but I do think it necessary to try to separate 18th and 19th century beliefs about the sublime from medieval belief. Coleridge, after all, talks in a general way about the expansion of his being into the infinite. Now, such ideas were certainly discussed in the Middle Ages, but in very specific contexts with regard to body and mind. Let me start with mind and to consider this idea of expansion of the self, as it were. In his early text, De Inventione, Cicero has this to say about making great, magnificentia, which he sees as part of the virtue of fortitude or courage. Magnificence is the consideration and management of important and lofty matters with a certain grandeur and splendid determination of mind, grandeur of mind. Now, in medieval matters, sublime things, sublimia, higher and especially religious things, are more likely to be found in the contemplation of the divine than in human action, the domain of magnificence. Accounts of mind are often monastic in character and purpose. They certainly weren't intended for art criticism or response theory, but we should at least consider them. And let's consider a well-known example. One such is opened up by Richard of Saint-Victor, who died in 1173, in his text, the so-called Mystical Ark, or Benjamin Major. The Mystical Ark is a treatise on speculative monastic practices of contemplation. In it, he identifies three stages or levels of mind: mentis dilatatio, mentis sublevatio, and mentis alienatio. He explains, enlarging of the mind is when the acute gaze of the mind is more widely broadened and more intensely sharpened, and yet this in no way goes beyond the normal mode of human activity. Elevation of the mind is when the liveliness of divinely suffused intelligence transcends the bounds of human activity, but not, however, passing into alienation of mind. Alienation of mind is when the memory of present things is forgotten and transfigured in the divine. The mind passes to a state both foreign and inaccessible to human activity. So we have widening, we have raising, and finally we have transcendence of self. But Richard makes it very clear that dilation and elevation are not alienation of mind. Well, it might be thought these levels were purely mental, without bodily affect, but this isn't quite so. Dilation and elevation of mind are still within human reasoning and feeling. Richard elsewhere also writes that in meditation, we examine and ruminate, while in contemplation, we marvel and wonder. In the very highest watchtower of our marveling speculations, he says, the rational soul especially rejoices and dances in the light with which it now sees even matters that are beyond reason. And even in this highest state, the soul dances in delight. Now, it should be emphasized that this kind of discourse of experience is a matter for a very specialized type of mental and spiritual discipline that cannot be brought directly into line with medieval accounts of architecture at large. Though Suget's treatises at Saint-Denis, to which I'll return presently, suggest it might have some place in making sense of artifacts. But what of the body? Indeed, the sense of the body. Let me turn to the great Romanesque pilgrimage church at Compostela in northern Spain, with its magnificent portal on the left and its grand interior, to develop some thoughts. Earlier, I noted how important was the sheer physical extent and luminosity of the Holy Sepulchre in Eusebius's account of its magnificence. It was precisely not a cramped and gloomy pagan temple. Exactly these values are selected in a well-known early to mid-12th century account of a very famous building, also like the Holy Sepulchre, devoted to pilgrimage. Pilgrim's Guide to Compostela, which describes the Church of St. James in its chapter 9. And here is a citation. I've picked out certain words, as you can see. In this church, you'll find no crack or defect. It's marvelously wrought, large, spacious, bright, fitting in scale, well proportioned in breadth, length, and height. It is considered a wonderful and ineffable work, which is even built in 2 stories, like a royal palace. Whoever walks through the upper galleries, if sad, when he ascended, becomes happy and joyful at the sight of the exceeding beauty of the temple. Well, this passage on a wonderful and ineffable work is clearly within what I would describe broadly as the Eusebian tradition, as a text on exceptionalism, which follows through into an actual experience, which itself has a narrative, an emotional narrative, the passage from sorrow to joy. This narrative is common in monastic works, but has an ancient lineage. It goes back to Dio Chrysostom's 1st century Olympic discourse about Phidias' sculpture of Zeus at Olympia, in the presence of which a wretched man would forget the various harshnesses of life. We find it also in Cassiodorus. We find it in the Dream of the Rood. We find it in Chaucer. We find it in the Pearl poem. Now, in this passage, there's an internal relation which also asks us to do some language work. So let's look at it a bit closer. Note the relation of the word latitudo to litus. Litus diphthonga scribitur, says Isidore of Seville. But laetitia, happiness, follows immediately from the recitation in the Pilgrim's Guide of the Church's scale and proportions, beginning with its breadth. Latitudo reminds us that Isidore of Seville, as you can see here, connects laetitia, written with a diphthong, to latitudo, or wideness, because tristitia is a constriction, angustia, as he points out. So we might say that there's a discursive link, as it were a kind of echo within this text, between the physical form of the building, its breadth of scale, and the perceiver's sense perception and affects. Now, let me just say in passing that affects or passions aren't what we would now call emotions exactly. A passion is rather like a movement, which originates outside ourselves, outside our bodies, and then affects our material senses, comes through the body. It's only in recent modern separation of reason from emotion that has given rise to our understanding of emotions as wholly internal or irrational things. Passions or affects can tug us in several, sometimes contradictory emotions. Experiences are often contradictory, but it's important to understand that they are movements or attitudes attracting or repelling us by turns, tugging us hither and thither. Now, Isidore clearly got his relation of happiness and sadness, expansion and contraction from the Stoics and Augustine. I've set this out here. The Stoics divide passions into 4 main types: pleasure and distress or pain, which relate to the present, and appetite and fear, which relate to the future. Augustine, as here, makes use of this Stoic classification of the basic emotions into 4 groups: pleasure, laetitia, appetite, cupiditas, distress, tristitia, and fear, metus, or timor. Here, he says that our affections are the motions of our minds. Joy is expansion, sorrow is contraction, and so on. And St. Bernard mentions exactly these expressive motions, which the Stoics had associated with the main types of movement, of emotion. So this is an embedded way of thinking, which is characteristic of 12th century thought too, originating in the Stoic Augustinian line. Now, I want to suggest that within the Pilgrim's Guide, we can trace this Stoic Augustinian relation of the physical form of the building to the physical, bodily, psychological form of the human body. So we can think of responses in terms of 2 affective movements, as it were: laetitia, delight, extension, expansion; tristitia, sadness, contraction. This is a form of somatic identification. Now, 2 swift points follow from this. The first, as I've already hinted, is that passions or affects can occur conjointly, causing conflict. For sadness and happiness go together, and the emotions are often mixed. as in the case of the perplexing powers of wonder associated with awe, but also with the monstrous and the weird. As just noted, emotions have a narrative. But my main point is that the banishment of sadness is implicit in the entire Christian doctrine of exaltation, magnification, and delight, and essentially at odds with the all-encompassing romantic vision of the fearsome and diminishing sublime. On the other hand, to push the point a little further, those interested in somatic and empathetic theory might be struck by the very broad analogy between the connection of latitude and laetitia and 19th century empathy theory of the type set out by Vischer, in which vertical and horizontal architectural spaces are transferred unconsciously from human bodies into the forms of the object, or August Schmarzoff's work Das Wesen der architektonischen Schöpfung of 1894. Well, I want to soft pedal that point in order partly not to put too much pressure on the Compostela text by pretending that it's cognate with modern ideas of empathy. My key point is that, bearing in mind that the passions contend, a positive order is a striking aspect of medieval sensory experiences of buildings, and there were ways of understanding this in terms of bodily identification. And so to Paris and Saint-Denis. The Pilgrim's Guide at Compostela forms part of a larger compilation, roughly contemporary with the single most famous text relating to a Gothic church, Abbot Suger's treatises on Saint-Denis. Since Erwin Panofsky's famous edition, Abbot Suger, died 1151, has tended to be regarded as a Neoplatonist, as a metaphysician, in thrall either to the mystic writings of the pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, or to the thought of the Victorines, one of whom, Richard of Saint-Victor, I've already mentioned in relation to states of mind. I think it fair to say that in the last generation, this metaphysical reading of Suger has come under pressure, either because it doesn't fully account for the nature of his texts, or because it has a weak explanatory relationship to what Suger was actually doing as a magnificent patron. Erwin Panofsky implicitly saw Suger's treatises as some sort of manifesto for Gothic as a movement. But the difficulties with this view have long been known, not least that Suger actually says very little about architecture, let alone style or form. His preoccupation, as we all know, is with liturgy, with the saints, with ars sacra, the sacred art of church ornaments, including metalwork and glass, which flourished equally in the Romanesque. Well, it's hard to say anything new about this beyond commenting on the value of the type of research into Suger's writings, which I think stresses the conventional way his thinking worked. And here I'd make 2 points, one about translation and the other about vocabulary. Here's one of the most famous passages which all students of Gothic art are well familiar with, from De Administratione, chapter 33. Wherefore, when sometimes from my delight in the ornament of God's house, let me pause there to note how this whole experience is kick-started by the sensory experience of delight in the ornament of God's house. The multicolored appearance of the gems may call me away from ordinary concerns, and indeed honest meditation by transferring from material things to immaterial ones may persuade me to focus on the diversity of the virtues of the saints. I seem to see myself linger as though on some distant shore of the globe, which may be neither entirely in the slime of the earth nor entirely in the purity of heaven, and then by anagogical practice, be able to be translated, God willing, from this lower to that higher. And you'll have noticed that I've given Mary Carruthers' translation of this well-known passage, not Panofsky's, because Carruthers' version makes the interesting point that this isn't an outright mystical experience. It's often presented as such, but it's based throughout on the senses. In Richard of St. Victor's terms, it falls into the category not of mentis alienatio, the final transcendent stage of contemplation, but rather sublevatio mentis, that raising up which remains within human sensory awareness. In a sense, what Suger is saying is anchored. Suger, though a monk, makes sense of the experience by stressing that it proceeds ex delectione, out of delight, and that the outcome is as though, quasi, he was in some distant shore, looking down on himself. He hasn't crossed over into some mystical state. So, accepting that translation, while we don't need to drive Neoplatonism out from Suger's account, far from it, we need to understand that it only makes sense in aesthetic terms. As Carruthers concludes, I quote, Suger doesn't look up and away from his human sensation in ecstatic rapture, as has often been said. Rather, he looks through its structure as through a lens, as one might say, of his stained glass or his marvelous chalice in Washington. I'm sure you all know it. I think a second, much larger point is that I have some sympathy with Willibald Saarlander's assessment that Panofsky's insistence on Suger's light metaphysics can be seen as what Saarlander calls the last and most seductive turn of the romantic dream of transcendence. What can be seen as a perfectly conventional interest in illumination, in light, as positive spiritual and ethical virtues, going back to Eusebius, Paulinus of Nola in the early Christian period, instead becomes a kind of cipher for the romantic thinking lingering, as we saw in Robert Branner's account of Gothic. In this sense, modernism harbored romanticism. Well, in regard to the conventional socio-aesthetic and not metaphysical discourse in Suger, I'd also draw attention to his frequent use of another idea. So let's take two further passages from De Administratione, which concern the west portal of the church. Here it is. The first passage I've given in Latin, and I've signaled out, as you can see, some word formations. The first passage, whoever seeks to extol the worth of the portals, marvel not at the gold or the expense, but at the labor of the work. The noble work glows brightly, but may the noble work that brightly glows illumine the minds to go through the true light, to the true light, where Christ is the true entryway. In what manner it may be here within the golden portal determines. The dull mind rises to the true through things material, and cast down before rises again on seeing this light. The second passage follows. The year of the word was 1000th, the 100th, and the 44th when it was consecrated. When the new posterior part is joined to the anterior, he's talking about the east and west ends of the church that he's rebuilding, the structure shines, illuminated in its center, glowing. It glows, joined to things that glow, suffused by a new light. The noble work glows, strikingly increased and expanded in our time. And I was Suger, its leader, while it was made. Well, I'm struck here by Suger's allusion to the idea of nobility, one scarcely discussed in analysis of his work, and itself undoubtedly of some complexity. The Latin word nobilitas has an old form, gnobilis, with a G at the front of it, stemming from the verb gnosco, to know, as in our words gnostic or agnostic. It's a knowledge word, naming that which is well known, famous, or renowned. Nobilitas, in this sense, is what is outstanding, what is exceptional. And that could mean outstanding spiritually or socially or ethically, noble, highborn, eminent, prominent, and so on. It isn't solely a secular term, but a bridging term like clarus or insignis. I'm struck by the ways in which the emphasis on Suger, the metaphysician, has distracted us from the socio-aesthetic character of his writing at large. And I'd stress that nobilitas, however construed, is undeniably a positive, not a negative term. Observe also in both passages that the idea that nobility is linked directly to the term glow, claret. It glows. Well, to see how this can, as it were, illuminate our discussion of experience, I want to follow this idea of nobility and its relatives through another text, which perhaps deserves fuller discussion than it has received, because it seems like a technical document, but I don't think is so. We jump forward to the years 1416 to 1417, looking at the right-hand image, and the so-called expertise recorded in Catalan and Latin held at Girona Cathedral, one of the great Gothic spaces of southern Europe, the Mediterranean coast of Spain. Well, an expertise is the term for a gathering of a series of experts, literally those with experience, to assess a problem, to troubleshoot. A celebrated one had occurred at Milan Cathedral a few years earlier at the turn of the century. Now, at Girona, the expertise was a series of meetings of various architects conducted and minuted over several months. And the issue was how to complete the nave, the choir, which you can see sort of through there, having been begun in a fashion familiar in Catalonia with 3 aisles, rather like a regular cathedral. The question was this: was it better to have a spectacular single vault over the nave or to carry on with the familiar multi-aisled basilican solution? And indeed, the first question posed by the bishop and the cathedral chapter to the Girona experts was indeed whether the single nave would be more noble, nobilius, than the triple nave. The term nobilis, in the sense of well-known or noble, as we've seen, had been used, though at a disputed date, of the Cathedral of Narbonne on the left-hand side, also an exceedingly lofty building. Narbonne, of course, is in southern France, not so far from Girona. Raised, as it was said, purportedly by Clement IV in the 1260s, but actually later, in imitation of the noble and magnificently worked churches which are being erected in the Kingdom of France. At Girona, the single-span solution won, as you can see, because it was favoured by the cathedral architect and was argued to be quicker and cheaper. That was certainly a miscalculation. The nave, in fact, took centuries to complete, and whether it was cheaper or not, we're never told. But it's true of committees then and committees now that the cheapness argument often wins as the smoking gun. But the Latin summary of the chapter adjudication that came at the end of all this stated that the single nave to be chosen would be, so to speak, more solemn, notable, notabilius, and proportionate, and much more happy and joyful in virtue of its shining brightness. Solemnius, notabilius, et proportionalibus, capiti dictae ecclesiae, quam incepto, quam sit opus trium navium superdictum. Tum, qui etiam multo maiore claritate fulgebit, quodus laetius et jocundum. Well, this adjudication probably took into account another of the expertises' findings, that the nave should be illuminated by a large rose window or windows in its east wall, perhaps bearing in mind the spectacular effect of the huge round window in the same position in the nave at Palma in Mallorca, already underway by then on the left-hand side and photographed tactically by me to make the point. The link of claritas to jocunditas and to notability is clear. Jocunditas, generally taken to mean agreeableness or pleasantness, delight, classically denotes both forms of pleasure and social bearing, friendship, and occurs quite commonly with laetitia, delight. It is at the warm end of the spectrum of feeling. Well, this and related terms derive pretty clearly from the long-standing Roman and Christian discourse of ethics, monastic virtue, and curialitas, or courtliness. From the early Middle Ages onwards, as Stephen Jager has argued brilliantly in his early work, laetitia, jocunditas, hilaritas, amicitia constitute what he calls an ideal court atmosphere, a bright and cheerful countenance spreading jocundity and happiness to all members of the royal palace was an external aspect of a virtuous courtly disposition. By their communal social nature, such virtues were true both of aristocratic and of monastic societies. And within the Christian dispensation, jocunditas and laetitia were also monastic and spiritual qualities, and they're referred to as such by Augustine, Cassiodorus, Boethius, and so on. That is demonstrable. So you see that my argument is pressing consistently in one direction. But we need to look closer at the socio-aesthetic word complexes in the medieval discourse of experience and the way they help to articulate not just religious ideas, for nobody would doubt that the purpose of Girona or Palma or any of these buildings was religious, but ideas also located in the secular domain. Drawing the two apart, as the 20th century did so commonly, has, I think, impoverished our understanding of what such experiences consisted of, their complexity above all. And in this sense, my account takes its cue from the earlier texts on magnificence, beginning with Eusebius. This isn't a style critical or style specific or even period specific discourse, but it has a social dimension, the linkage of light, joy, and so on to the noble or the aristocratic. There are a number of routes forward from this understanding. For instance, take the issue of the wonderful height and size of the great northern French Gothic cathedrals. The expression comes from a document relating to Beauvais Cathedral, celebrating the entry of the cathedral canons into their doomed church of wonderful height and size prior to its collapse in 1284, and subsequently rebuilt in present form. Wonder at the loftiness of such buildings starts, as we know and as we have seen, with the Eusebian tradition. It's a term easily, but not necessarily, helpfully annexed to the project of a transhistorical sublime. The term sublimis is never, to my mind, used of buildings or artifacts in the Middle Ages, and was not in this sense a critical term. It's a poetic term. But the notion of nobility most certainly was, as I've tried to show. And it's worth noting whether the initial reactions to such exceedingly tall buildings entailed an idea of nobility. The late Middle English sense of the word tall, after all, includes prompt, active, handsome, elegant, fine, valiant, and so on. It connects to verbs and adjectives of the sort being connected here. Low, in contrast, of course, conveys a position in the social or moral hierarchy quite as much as the high and mighty sovereign, a term introduced into English political culture by Richard II's reign. It also such high style in language hierarchy or magniloquentia is what, according to Chaucer's host, Harry Bailey, is done when that men to kings write. You adopt the high style according to the occasion. Height becomes a spatial metaphor of a certain sort of social value. A noble or an honest building or artifact is so because it has to do with honest arbitration and judgment. A noble building is what nobles will approve of, and what is honourable, as in the Girondist Expertise's assessment of a single great vault. My account of experience, then, is much more inclined to link secular and religious values, which intersect and which mutually illuminate each other. And in this, ultimately, I take my cue from the history of the word basilica itself, which, as I mentioned earlier, in regard to Richard Krautheimer's discussion of the earliest great Christian churches, was tied verbally to the idea of the palace. I've commented elsewhere on the church as palace idea in the Middle Ages. A moment ago, we saw that the Pilgrim's Guide to Compostela likens the church to a palace because of its double stories. We find this idea in many other Latin sources. The church, like the palace, may be tall. It may be furnished with wonderful marbles and columns, an idea found not just in Eusebius, but in the legacy of Latin poetic treatment of palaces. We found it in Ovid, in Statius, and in Virgil, and we find it throughout the Middle Ages. Churches, like palaces, could be noble, and indeed shining marble was often held to be a noble material, as at Lincoln Cathedral or here at Canterbury, with the great marble columns around the shrine of the holy blissful martyr Thomas. So who or what drove the palace and the church apart? Well, I'd like to suggest that whatever the cause, the process of division is implicit in the most influential 20th century accounts of medieval aesthetics. A major one, to which we're greatly indebted, of course, is Meyer Shapiro's wonderful paper published in 1947 on the aesthetic attitude in Romanesque art, which I've taken as a kind of springboard. Shapiro does very much what I'm doing this evening. Shapiro's seminal study targets the idea, I quote, that medieval art was strictly religious and symbolical, submitted to collective aims and wholly free from the aestheticism and individualism of our age. End quote. In particular, Shapiro saw the liturgical church, the formal church, as lacking the aesthetic freedom of externality of the city, of the margins. Logically, but I think questionably, he stated, I quote, the effect of architectural beauty upon feeling is more commonly noted in descriptions of refectories, chapter houses, and the private chambers of bishops and abbots, end quote. Hence, there was a sphere of artistic creativity, as he says, without religious content and imbued with values of spontaneity, individual fantasy, delight, and expression that anticipate modern art. Now, those extremely rich and complex sentiments create the impression that the center was not a zone of intelligent creativity or delight. It isn't so much that Shapiro tends to secularize creativity, though this is true. Religion as such plays little part in his account. It's more that he seems to prejudge almost what creativity is. Now, the rift in 20th century modernist writing becomes clearer. We have, on the one hand, Panofsky's Neoplatonized transcendence, and on the other hand, we have Shapiro's notion of the secular, the urban, as the true domain of inventive aesthesis. They sound different, but they're really two sides of the same modernist coinage, I think, which produce this kind of binary thinking, center margin, religious, secular, and so on, that still, I think, affect our field, not always helpfully. As the centre became purified and sacralized and transcendent, the daily, the marginal, became the true domain of feeling, and indeed truth itself. The discourse of marginality was born, paradoxically, from the intellectualism of writers of Panofsky's generation. But it is ultimately, I think, a romantic achievement. Well, I'm coming to my concluding remarks, but before winding up, I just want to say a few words by way of summary before introducing the topic of my second lecture. And we have before us, of course, those marvelous images from Autun in Burgundy, carved by Giselbertus, the terror and horror of the torments of hell. Today, I've covered about a millennium of thought about buildings in an effort to present some fresh, or at least neglected, insights into the nature of the experience of those buildings. I've argued that the experience language familiar to us from medieval sources, without doubt, stems from early Christianity and its inheritances from the ancient world, and that much of it fell into place in the wake of Constantine. In discussing such thinking from Eusebius onwards, I've been struck by the extent to which it is in fact non-transcendental, that the virtues of religious and secular buildings were readily identifiable socio-aesthetic virtues. Almost everything in this language is thus necessarily positive in tone. We can't understand the discourse of experience without considering its occasional nature, that complex rhetorical notion of occasion, which is often more helpful than context alone. Very often panegyric was one such, praise of emperors, praise of saints. It's very often in hagiography that we find the richest accounts of such buildings. The metrical life of St. Hugh of Lincoln of 1220 or so is one such occasion. I've therefore implied that by overemphasizing the transcendental, as I believe may have been the case with the aesthetic theorizing of the 20th century, we may have tended to overlook the sensory and the social, and with it the ethical. Now, this isn't an original point, and nor is it an anti-religious one, but it is important if we want to get the balance right. To say that experience language was positive is partly to say that no one in the Middle Ages constructed great churches or palaces specifically in order to induce fear as a negative emotion, which I distinguish from beneficial fear, or of the type we see at Autun, where terror and horror are incentives to improve us. But all experience, it must be said, is mixed. It can be lofty, as John Burrow has shown in his study of the poetry of praise in the Middle Ages. It is a simple fact that much medieval aesthetic and literary practice is magnificatory, is written in the epideictic mode of praise. That is to say, the purpose of which is to enlarge artfully the object of praise by amplification, just to aggrandize it, and therefore, I think, us. Magnification is a verbal or visual making great. It's a process, and by doing it singly or collectively, we who praise or who witness the praise and who thereby imitate are enlarged, not diminished, in romantic fashion. Well, I readily admit that this raises the issue of whose experience, given the high-flown and socially exclusive nature of our Latin and Greek and occasionally vernacular sources. It also raises the peril of imagining a single aesthetic order in the Middle Ages, the belief that architecture in the Middle Ages was governed by a kind of pan-aesthetic series of norms appropriate to what we used to call an age of faith. This can't have been so. Today, I've only rarely considered the fate of the palace church, the basilica. But as in language, so in the arts, the various levels of experience were as mixed in reality as they were in rhetoric. The various effects I've considered were always understood appropriately as points on a sliding scale. Levels of style and artifact, as much as speech, were relational and mixed. Excuse me. So it must be the case that certain categories of artifact were consciously intended to repel or strike fear, giant castles or castle-like cathedrals, such as that at Albi in southern France, as part of a crusade, or representations of the punishment of hell. All these are aspects of the role of fear, terror, in its beneficial or fruitful sense, as St. Augustine would put it, establishing an incentive system, admonishing and directing us. Ugliness and pain had their role in ethics and medieval spirituality too. A developing aspect of my account will be to look at these effects and to ask, amongst other things, what the role of the totality of the senses was in the experience of awe and terror, and why it is that accounts of sound, rather than sights, thaumata, are often connected with what was felt to be terrible. And that raises the issue of motivation in the mixed medieval economy of pleasure and pain. For in any such ethically directed economy, the rationale of artifacts can't be entirely separated from their purposes, from their ends. What are they for? These might be just to give pleasure, a newly fashionable area of research, I'm happy to say, as much as to admonish or to elevate or to instruct. Both fear and pleasure suitably channeled can lead to action. And indeed, the whole purpose of persuasive activity is to change belief, and ultimately what we do, we're persuaded to change not only our hearts, but our actions. Motivation matters in this account of the pleasurable utility of things. We're motivated to do, to believe, or to be something other than what we are. But what is it to think of a work of art motivating anything? In my second lecture, I want to place at the heart of place this issue at the heart of an account of emotion and engagement, and I want specifically to ask how it is that artifacts, fictions such as the sculptures at Chartres or the sculptures at Magdeburg in Germany, there you are, two different affective registers, if you wanted one. I want to ask specifically how such artifacts can perform ethical roles. Today, I've sketched in the idea that medieval experience language reads across from people to artifacts and back again by means of the transferred epithet. Thus, we can speak of people being noble or beautiful or dazzling or cheerful or miserable. But we can also speak of artifacts as having those qualities. And because those qualities can transfer back from object to subject, the process is reflexive. The positive, noble, cheerful effects of a building can instill those affects in us, can magnify us, make us great, and not diminish us. So when, at late 12th century Canterbury, the martyr Thomas Becket was likened to a column of the church in Pauline or Eusebian fashion, he too was held up as a model to imitate. Such buildings don't make us nothing, they make us something. The issue at stake, I think, is ethical, aesthetic, rhetorical. It isn't necessarily solely transcendental. The entire pastoral mission of the 13th century church was based, so it seems to me, on claims about what was not only admirable in people, but what was attainable, reasonably attainable, that humanity isn't simply locked into theological paradoxes or wondrous otherworldly transcendences, but is liberated by the imitation of that which is worthy of aspiration and graspable as a statue, as real. And this is why sculpture was one of the primary vehicles in warming up, persuading, and perhaps motivating people. But that raises an entirely new set of problems about how we understand fictions. And it will be the work of my second lecture next month on the figurative arts to ask what those problems might be. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul, for an absolutely enthralling, indeed elevating lecture. I have so much paper, so many notes around me that I hardly know where to begin, but I will begin here by, if it's okay with you, having some questions and some comments from the audience that's watching us on YouTube. And we begin with our very own Catherine White, who makes a comment and then follows it with a question. May I?
Go ahead.
She says, you can probably see it in the chat too if you wanted to. You explain how we can use more apt, historically mediated language for studies of the medieval era instead of modern concepts, e.g. affect instead of emotion, or compassion and empathy. How do you feel about using modern concepts while studying medieval art? For example, feminist readings using a modern understanding of gender.
Oh, I don't think there's any problem. I mean, I think that the fact that I take an historicist stance doesn't mean that I'm determining what we should think or feel about these works, these artifacts at all. And my entire approach is entirely modern in many ways. I mean, to consider the nature of experience is, I think, to take a modern approach. So I don't see any difficulty with that. The fact that I'm trying to explore the alterity of language and thought in the Middle Ages doesn't mean that I am in any way how can I put it, in any way opposed to other modern forms of reading. I consider myself a creation of the modern era. Some people might differ from what I've said, but I think that would be my view. And indeed, I have made increasingly how can I put it, increasingly experimental interventions into the nature of the gendered character of form in the Middle Ages. So I don't see a difficulty with that at all. I don't know if that answers or reassures the observation. It's a very big question, but I mean, to a certain extent, everything that we do is a dialogue between our own historical position and the past. In my view, taking into account the knowledge that they were very probably different from us, and that their views may have been ancestral to us, but that they weren't quite like us. That's the point I would make. But it seems to me some measure of, how can I put it, cultural appropriation is inevitable because we're all historically positioned. I don't know if that will satisfy you.
Kat, satisfied?
I'm not seeing the speaker or my interlocutor, so I don't know.
Yes. I would like to remark that many of the audience members on YouTube clapped. So you had applause.
Oh, good.
Awesome applause icons.
Well, maybe it was a secret, historically mediated form of disapproval.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that reassurance.
But I do have, as we wait for our audience to formulate their questions, I'm very intrigued with the notion of nobility and nobilitas as part of the mental equipment, I suppose, with which these magnificent, extraordinary monuments are conceived. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it's going to be. I'm going obviously to try to amplify this text into a larger study. Part of the issue in my mind is to what extent these things, how culturally specific these things are, and whether, for example, the idea of nobility is characteristic of Greek texts. I didn't talk much about Byzantine or Greek literature. There are issues there. I mean, in other words, to what extent this is, so to speak, a feudal question, a kind of emanation of a mindset that is produced by a certain set of socioeconomic and military circumstances. Nobilitas, of course, is itself quite a rich concept. It is, I mean, there are nobles in the Middle Ages, as it were. There are kings and nobles, and then there is a separate concept which may or may not apply to them, which is the concept of nobility. Those are separable. I mean, there's a marvelous discussion of this in Sandy Murray's book on Reason and Society in the Middle Ages, where he talks about the tendency in the Middle Ages to associate virtue, radiant virtue, with nobility. That's a simple fact that the text observes. What I'm trying to do is to read that back onto the buildings, because it seems to me completely consistent with many of the sources in a way that simply hasn't been pointed out. As a dull historian and as a plodding rationalist, I feel bound to sort of ask about those connections. So there's if I may just try one path of inquiry, there's a distinction between nobles on the one hand, who can often behave very badly and of whom there's a great critique. As we know, kings, particularly in England, can be terrible tyrants. There's a tremendous discourse of tyranny in the Middle Ages, but equally there is an idea of nobility which is spiritual, and which has a very distinguished ancestry. It also in the pre-Christian period, in notions of the great soul, magnanimity, that kind of thing. So this is a complex thing. It's something I very much want to enlarge on, and it points in all sorts of different directions. And I think it's quite important to think about it in relation both to the ecclesiastical context and to the palace context, which I think is often more continuous with what happens in churches than people maintain. What I haven't been able to speak about this evening, to my regret, simply for lack of time, is the way that churches are described as palaces. We've seen that in Compostela, but it's quite a common trope, and I find it a very interesting one.
Well, that's fascinating. And I will go back and mine my own sources, because one of the things I've been reading about are structures that we think of as sort of infrastructural in the modern sense, bridges and roads and things like that, and how in Northern Italy in the later Middle Ages, they're spoken of with language, with beauty language. They are noble, they are beautiful, language that we don't necessarily think of when we think of, toll booth. And I had really not been sensitized. My ear, my eye, my brain had not been sensitized to that language. And now I want to go back and see what kinds of formulations people make in regard to those kinds of structures, given that the people for whom these structures, who are basically paying for these structures, are the same people. But before I go on too long about my own inquiry, I would like to return to a question from our department chair, David Cataforas. He says, "Thank you, Professor Binski, for your fascinating lecture. It struck me throughout that your exploration of language as a medium for articulating and mediating the experience of architecture was accompanied by photographs of churches, mostly interiors, which also mediate that experience in ways that were not available to medieval people. Could you speak to the effects of photography and modern understandings of medieval architecture?"
Oh wow! Well, of course, this is a huge subject, and it's one that's being explored, I think, more interestingly, apropos of the subject of your our seminar this term, in the field of sculpture than it is in architecture, because of course and this is again something I'm afraid I really couldn't go into, but of course movement, the changing subjectivity of buildings, the changing illumination of buildings, the time of day, the occasion, the aesthetic, the social, religious occasion, of course affects experiences, because experiences are narratives. There isn't an experience. There is an unfolding encounter with these things, which unfolds with our physical and emotional engagement with buildings, and the question of how that's captured, of course, in film or photography is a huge problem. This is a pressing issue actually in discussions of sculpture at the moment. How sculpture can try imperfectly, but nevertheless, can try to convey movement around objects. Film, of course, does it much better. There's been a long dissatisfaction, I think, with sort of straightforward academic photography as a way of conveying the experience of building. Steve Murray at Columbia made film, was amongst the first to make academic films, so to speak, about the movement, what it is to move through a building as a way of conveying experience. But of course, how that affects the granularity of experience, the true nature of experience, is always very hard to say, because phenomena are very, very hard to track historically. So I said at the start that this is a very, very tricky area. And a lot of the time we are dependent on language quite as much as on the buildings. It's a very, very good question, but it's a very big one.
Thank you very much. And I have yet another question for you from Kara Nordengren, another one of our seminarians. She says, "Thank you for your interesting and engaging presentation. I'm very interested in the concept of beneficial fear as a part of the experience of language for medieval people. Yes. I would be interested to hear if and how, or how you distinguish between fear that benefits the viewer, such as fear of the Last Judgment, as opposed to fear that benefits the producer, that provoked by the foreboding walls of a medieval city or castle."
Yeah, well, they can be the same thing, of course. I mean, the point that I want to insist on, first of all, is that there isn't a single age of faith, affective order in these buildings. All experience is complexified. I raised the question of fear partly in order to make that point, and also partly to address the question of the sublime, which in the post in the sort of post-medieval, early modern sense, is often connected to ideas of fear. But the problem is what type of fear. As I've suggested, on the whole, the accounts that we have of buildings have to do with that which is beneficial. That's not surprising. After all, let's face it, people don't write negative accounts of things very often. One might say that this is an inevitable outcome. After all, how many failed miracles do we hear about in the Middle Ages? How many sort of failed attempts by saints to cure people do we hear about? We don't, unless there's competition, unless you're doing down another building. But in regard to beneficial fear is that kind of fear that leads us to the good. Esther Cohen has written about this brilliantly in regard to medieval philopassionism. That's to say, the use of the imagery of suffering or of fear to bring us to the good, to bring us to understanding. And a great deal of the visual culture of the macabre and of death in the late Middle Ages is based on fruitful or beneficial fear, that experiences should be fruitful. That is an idea that goes back, I think, into Alia, back to Augustine. But there's no question that those who designed the great castles along the line between England and Wales in the late 13th century, I showed one earlier on, Conway, they were certainly intending to depress and suppress the population. In that sense, they may be more easily assimilable to the sublime. They are the castle of Otranto, if you will, than the religious buildings to which we've looked. This is a huge subject. It has many, many ramifications. Anyway, would my interlocutor like to follow up? Can I say more? Would you like to prod me to say something further?
Well, interlocutor. Well, while we hear from your interlocutor, we have some more observations that are coming in, but also I'd like to make an announcement. I've had some communications. We've had some communications that some people are having a hard time typing their questions into YouTube chat. To those people that are having difficulty, we recommend that you refresh YouTube or close and restart YouTube, and you should be able to type your questions directly with no trouble. That said, I have a question from my colleague, Professor Marnie Kessler. Your discussion of luminosity made me think about the effects of the weather and how the light of sunny versus an overcast day would, for example, affect the viewer's sensorial experience within a space. Are you interested in these contingent and transitory elements of experience?
Well, as I've already indicated, the answer is I am interested in them, but the question is how we understand them historically and how they were discussed in the Middle Ages. There aren't discussions about mood in buildings. Mood is an important thing. How the mood of a building will change when the sun goes in. So I'm very interested in it because the whole question of light isn't simply an architectural question. It's a question of artificial lighting, of candles, of torches, other forms of light. And studies have been written about this. I mean, the strategic use of light in buildings, how shrines are spotlighted by windows, and how the cathedral church at Ely, not far from where I'm speaking to you from Cambridge, was rebuilt in the 14th century to spotlight the shrine of St. Etheldred deliberately. Those sorts of things fascinate me. They are clearly part of a strategy because they thought about light as an important commodity, whatever one wants to call it, in planning buildings. As we saw at Girona, they thought tactically about it. But the question of how one would ground the subtler changes in mood and illumination in a discourse, I find harder to answer very clearly. I think it does need to be looked at. And I'm fascinated by it, and I want to hunt around to find what more can be said.
You. Kara says that she cedes her airtime on light for the moment so that we can hear more questions from other interlocutors. I have Klusky from the University of Notre Dame in Australia. Writes, another at the other end of the universe. Is it possible to excavate something of the artist's experience in the Middle Ages? What are the possibilities and limitations?
Oh gosh, well, artists' self-inscription, artists' accounts of themselves don't exist in that sense, and I think the short answer is that it is only really with the Renaissance and early modern period that we begin to get the kind of self-reflexivity, if that's what you're getting at, that would help us with that one. I don't think there's I'm trying to think, but I don't think there's a single instance where we can speak wholeheartedly. But I would say this much: it's worth looking at I talked about the expertise at Girona. It's written in Catalan. The language that is being used by the architects who come to this expertise. They're coming from Iberia, Catalonia, Spain. They're coming from France. The language they're using is, in a sense, a measure of how they experience and how they reason. And it's what's impressive about it, I think, is partly how recognizable it is, but also how they're not preoccupied with the sorts of things that preoccupy scientifically minded formalist art historians, who are fascinated by buttresses and structure and moldings and the exact relationship of and how pointed the art. They're thinking about the big effects, and I find that remarkable because in a sense it vindicates the idea that the fact that the discourse of experience doesn't track stylistic change shouldn't surprise us. That's not a problem because it doesn't necessarily concern them in the way we think it should. But I'm afraid the self-reflexive thing, I think that's asking an awful lot of the sources, and I don't think we have very much to guide us.
Thank you. I would encourage those of us who are having trouble with the chat question mechanism, again, to close down YouTube and restart, or alternatively, to email me at arelimarina@ku.edu, and I'm very happy to pass on your queries. I regret to say that we seem to be having a little bit of a technical glitch there, unfortunately. And I suppose I should check my email to see what happens when I say that. Karen McCluskey in Australia says, thank you, with many exclamation points. I was very intrigued by the foreshadowing that you gave us of your next lecture. And I wonder, and I'm looking at my notes here, whether we can rely on, what can we find, sort of medieval texts that comment on the experience of sculpture in quite the same way as we do have texts that comment on the experience of architecture?
Yeah. I beat my breast when I think how little there is, really, and what we count as a comment on an artifact, in a way. There are a few well-known ones which I've discussed in my little book on Gothic sculpture. A famous one regarding the confrontation of King John of England, a bad king of the tyrannical type, with St. Hugh of Lincoln. It's part of the Magna Vita of Hugh of Lincoln. Very often the saints' lives are the occasions for this. That I find interesting because it's part of this panegyrical or heroic tradition. And Hugh leads John up to this great portal and says, you see the miserable kings going to hell on the one hand, and you see the happy people on the other hand going to heaven. Draw the obvious conclusion from this. But those sorts of accounts, which are very conventional, it's an absolutely Gregorian thing that we're led to the good by art. It's very dull to our mindset, but it's doctrine, and these things are there partly. Their purpose is partly to impart doctrine. The fact of the matter is we have incredibly little knowledge about what actual experiences were. There may be some prescriptive accounts of it and what we should do in front of images and that kind of thing, and I'd certainly like to think a little bit more about that, but there's not a great deal. And what that means is that our accounts of the encounter with some of the most extraordinary cultural products of the 12th and 13th centuries aren't guided by any real clues to what the public were like, what the hierarchy of opinion about things were, what the gender balance was like in thinking about I know that that's a subject of some discussion at the moment, but it's quite hard to ground unless you do it by extension from the experience of another medium, for example, theatrical productions, which aren't necessarily of the same period. So there are ways of sort of getting around it, but they're imperfect, and they're very often, fictions basically. And that relationship of fictional response to real artifacts fascinates me very much. It's what I want to talk about next time, what it is to be motivated by a fiction. But we've got very little to go on. I'm probably not being much help here, but I think the simple fact is medievalists are as they are because they have to use their imaginations because they've got so little to go on. I really, you'll know what I'm getting at. We don't have enough really to anchor the great zeppelin of intellectual medieval intellectual life to any kind of reality. It's like a great balloon that floats off, but there's very little to ground it, I'm afraid. Yeah, and I do think that returning to the sources. Mm-hmm. I know this sounds a little bit old-fashioned, but I do believe that really squeezing the sources for thought is the only option that we have, which is why I do believe in close reading, language work, word work.
And yeah, no, please. And I wonder to what extent, I'm thinking about the words that we have about sculptures, they tend to be miracle working images, tend to be the one that we have. And to what extent we can extrapolate from this very...
Yeah, well, I'd pick up on that by saying that this is part of a larger point, that I think there's a risk in extrapolating from the miraculous to the ordinary. And I'm actually, part of my interest in some of these sources, particularly the expertises, is when you get the guys who are actually building the buildings talking in their language about the building, what one might call the daily craft aspect of creating these structures, the daily experience of them. And the language is not miraculous. The whole point about the Girona expertise is they talk about your conditas later. It's going to be, you can see the bishop saying it's going to be happier and more cheerful to do that. He doesn't know that he's in a great tradition of associated with the language does it for him. That's how we work. We think in terms of cliches. But the fact of the matter is that that kind of terminology is in a way a given. And anyway, sorry, it's getting rather late here. I have to say, it's coming up to 1 o'clock in the morning. So if I seem to be nodding off, it's simply because the time zone problem is going to catch up with me. But anyway, I intend to press on. Yeah.
And we should have acknowledged early on that, of course, Professor Binski is speaking to us from England, and so that means that it is now
10 to 1 in the morning. I'm a night bird. Don't worry, I can do more. But yeah.
We are extremely grateful for the verve and the energy, as well as the intellectual stimulation which you have brought to us this evening. I suspect that we will be having some follow-up questions that I will email you from the people who are unable to connect to us via YouTube. And all I can say is thank you very, very much for your thoughts. I'm very excited about the next talk in November, ideally also in person and in live streamed. And we look forward to seeing you, we students, tomorrow at our individual research sessions.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Aralee. And just to say that it's been a great honor to give this lecture and the next one, to meet your wonderful students. I'm just grateful for the opportunity to talk about these preoccupations. It seems to me that one of the great luxuries of academic life that one can do that. One can't expect everybody to agree, but one can at least put a case forward, and that's what I tried to do this evening. So thank you very much for your time and consideration. I appreciate it very, very much.
And thank you for your generosity in bringing the Middle Ages to us by whatever means are necessary.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, audience, for coming and hearing our first Franklin Murphy Talk of the Year. We look forward to seeing you in the flesh or in the bite in about a month. Bye-bye.